Congress initially imagined that this pause would only be 6 months back in March of 2020, but extensions from both Trump and Biden were made as a national emergency because of the pandemic. So realistically, how many more pauses can we potentially see?
It's a great question. So, the legal authority that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration relied on to issue these multiple short term extensions are rooted in the HEROES Act of 2003, which allows modifications to federal loan programs in the event of a national emergency. Coincidentally, that's the same authority that the administration relied on to implement the one time cancellation program as well. But it is rooted in the pandemic. And I think at some point, obviously, the pandemic emergency would end, as would the legal basis for extending the pause. So it's unlikely that the pause can just be extended indefinitely on an open-ended basis. We might see litigation to try to stop a further extension of the pause if that happens. So that's another angle that we'll have to keep an eye on next year.
As you know, Republicans are retaking control of Congress come the new year. So will that impact anything in terms of student loans?
Yes and no. So the GOP is poised to take over the House of Representatives with a slim majority. That likely removes any realistic chance that Congress would pass some sort of student loan forgiveness legislation, for instance, to codify Biden's one-time cancellation program. But that didn't look like it was even happening under Democratic control of both houses of Congress. So that doesn't really change anything. The one area where it really could come into play is the House of Representatives could potentially file its own lawsuit to challenge either this or a different loan cancellation program or another extension of the student loan pause, arguing that the administration exceeded congressional authority in doing that. We'll have to wait and see if that happens.
Do you think that lawsuit would have legs?
It's possible. It's one of those things where courts are sometimes wary of Congress or a chamber of Congress, stepping in to litigate. But it's not necessarily totally unprecedented. And if a court determines that they have standing to do that, it could be an issue.
Earlier, you did mention income-driven repayment plans, which are expected for 2023. So can you explain what they are?
So an income-driven plan, or IDR for short, is an umbrella term that describes a collection of individual plans that are all a little bit different, but at a basic level, they all function in a similar way. They use a formula applied to the borrower's income. Typically, their adjusted gross income is reported on their federal tax return and adjusted for family size. And it results in a uniquely calculated monthly payment for the borrower that gets adjusted every year. So as the borrower's income changes, the payment changes. And over time, some borrowers will pay off their loans in full, but others will not. And depending on the specific plan, after 20 or 25 years, any remaining balance could be forgiven. Now, that could be treated as taxable income to the borrower. That's exempted to the end of 2025 under temporary legislation. But that's generally how the programs work. There's been two major changes to income-driven repayment. One is this IDR account adjustment, which is a one-time fix that will allow certain past periods that otherwise wouldn't have counted towards the borrower's loan forgiveness term to be credited. That includes certain periods of repayment as well as some periods of deferment and forbearance. And that can cause some folks ultimately to get much closer to that loan forgiveness threshold than they otherwise would have been. There also is a new income-driven plan that the Biden administration has mentioned is currently in development. Based on the few details that we have, it sounds like that plan might be more affordable for a large number of borrowers, but final regulations have not yet been released, and so we're still waiting on those details.
Could these changes face any potential legal challenges?
It's possible. So far, there are not any indications of that. The IDR account adjustment was announced many months ago, and so far there's been no legal challenges to that, but I suppose anything is possible. In terms of the new income-driven plan, the regulatory authority of the Education Department to issue new plans under existing statute is fairly broad. It's totally different from the HEROES Act disputes that we're seeing. So I suppose there could be a challenge to that, but I think that there's general agreement that there's less room for dispute in terms of the Education Department's authority to craft a new income-driven plan.
2023, you wrote for Forbes that borrowers need to buckle up because it could potentially be a more wild ride than even 2022. So you also write that new regulations are usually good news for borrowers. Why is that?
Well, not always, but in this case, I think the new regulations are good news. The administration has been working on the last couple of years to develop new regulations governing nearly every major federal student loan program, and the changes are largely good for borrowers. This includes programs like public service loan forgiveness, the total permanent disability discharge, borrower defense to repayment, which allows folks to request a loan discharge on the basis of school misconduct, and a number of other programs. There's a whole bunch of changes, and these changes largely are borrower friendly. They're designed to make it easier for borrowers to qualify, easier for borrowers to apply, and easier for borrowers to get relief. Those changes are all set to be effective as of July 1st, 2023. So that's good news. The bad news is that whenever programs are changed or tweaked, especially on a mass scale, there's always room for problems. The rollout might be bumpy. The Department of Ed relies on a network of contracted loan servicers to implement these changes, and there's not exactly a great track record of these types of changes going smoothly. So changes in this particular context, I think, are good, but doesn't mean it's not going to be problem-free.
So in that sense, how can borrowers best prepare to avoid any bumpy roads or any confusion?
Well, for one thing, since most borrowers' payments have been on pause now for over 2 years and will exceed 3 years by the time this latest extension ends, make sure that you have all the latest information on these programs. The U.S. Department of Education does publish some pretty good fact sheets at studentaid.gov. Make sure that your loan contact information, email address, phone number, mailing address are all up to date, especially if you've moved. Reevaluate your repayment plan options, especially if your current circumstances are different from what they were when the pause first went into effect in 2020. I think we can all speak to the fact that last few years have been, lots of up and downs for people. You might have moved, you might have gotten married, you might have gotten divorced, you might have changed jobs. So whatever it is, whatever was going on with your loans before the pause went into effect, it's a good idea to kind of do a check-in and see what makes the most sense for you now, given your updated situation and given the new changes that will be in effect soon.
Definitely. Adam Minsky, thank you so much.